This is Broken Quattros. Today I wanted to talk about something really fast. The most common question I probably get asked is about the differences between the different 20 valve turbo 5-cylinder engines that Audi made back in the day. So I'm going to quickly kind of go through some of those differences, what they are, what they consist of, how they can be overcome, what application is best to use what in, and just kind of the general rundown. So that's what we're going to cover today. First up, let's see what we got here and kind of show some things. So here we go. Boom. This is a North American spec. Oh, I should mention, all of these motors that I'm going to be talking about are the US versions of the 20 valve 5-cylinder engine. I'll briefly discuss some of the other engines, but I'm primarily going to focus on these. So this is the 7A motor. It's found in the 1990 and 1991 Audi Quattros that were either in the 90 or in the Coupe Quattro. So this is the motor it came with. This is an earlier version. It had this beautiful bag of snakes exhaust manifold. This was actually the stock header that came on it. It's a beautiful equal length header that they used on this motor. This is a 2.3 liter. It's a little bit larger than the turbo versions, which are 2.2. We'll kind of talk about some of the similarities here as we go through them here, though. This is the 3B. So this came in the US. It came in the 1991 Audi 200 Quattro, and it came in both the sedans and in the Avants, assuming it was a Quattro model. Again, this is an early version, 2.2 liter, and yeah. This is the AAN motor. We got this in the 1992 through 1994 Audi S4, as well as the 95 and 95.5 Audi S6. Again, at the S6, we also had it in a wagon or Avant version. It was the same basic motor. So let's talk about what's similar in these three motors, and let's talk about what's different in these motors. First thing, if we're starting at the bottom end of this engine, they all actually have the same crank. It's the same part number, same everything, same crank. They also share the same rods, so they all have the same rods. The AAN and the 3B both share the same pistons, and the 7A is kind of the oddball of the group, and it had larger pistons, and that's why it's a 2.3. And common knowledge or common folklore is that these are cast pistons, whereas those are forged pistons in the turbo models. So, next thing to talk about would be, let's talk maybe about the differences between the applications that these are used in. So obviously this engine came in the small chassis. It's in the B series, so B3 and B4 had this style engine. I guess not the B4 in the US, but B4s everywhere else. This came in the larger C3 chassis. This came in the C4 chassis. Now, big differences between the C3 and the C4 chassis is that in the C3 chassis, in the 200s, these still had a side-mounted radiator, whereas when you move to the C4, they actually came with a front-mounted radiator. And that made a lot of the big differences between these two motors, and the reason why you would want one in the other, one in a different application over the other. As you can see, this is the intake manifold, and it wraps back around over the top of the motor, kind of coming over the turbo and so forth. And then you have both your charged air on both on the same side of the motor, whereas on this motor you'd have your turbo here, outlet here, and then it would run across the front of the car and into the intake over on this side instead of it wrapping back around and over. The reason they did that is because on the C4 chassis you didn't have a side-mounted radiator where the radiator would normally be right here. You didn't have that. You had the space to have it here. It's a more efficient flow and a better flow design. On the 200 you did have the radiator there. You couldn't actually have it coming out there, and so they wrapped it back around the engine to help with the packaging. So good and bad things about that. Obviously, like I said, you have a lot more heat shields and a lot more things going on here to keep the heat, to abate it from the intake track. And obviously that can be a problem. The runners and so forth, the airflow changes. The later style AAN has a much higher flowing intake manifold. And so these are some of the small little things to take into consideration. Now, when I'm considering, if I'm talking about which engine I'm actually going to put in a car, for me, it's all about availability. Obviously, these cars are older. They're hard to find. They were only in very certain models. And so if I want to do a 20 valve turbo engine swap into my Coupe Quattro or into a 90 or even a B2 chassis or something like that, one of the main things I consider is the availability and what's close by me. Shipping an engine, getting an engine across the country that is in unknown condition can lead to a lot of problems. You can obviously get a bad motor, and you could be spending a lot of money to ship that bad motor. And so that's kind of one of my biggest decisions when I'm actually planning a swap. And so that's why I like to keep these engines around when I do find them, when I do come across them, when I find a good deal. I snag them, I keep them in my garage and wait for the next project to roll around. So that's one of the biggest considerations I make. Now, both of the 3B and the AANs are already turbocharged. They're turbo friendly. They're really ready for some action. If you're putting it into a small chassis, one of the things you do have to consider is the intake manifold and how you're going to do that. There are a few options. You can swap on a 3B intake manifold. It'll swap right onto this. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that all these heads started with the same castings, and so all of the parts are kind of interchangeable to a degree. One of the interesting things about the 7A motor, because it was naturally aspirated, it wasn't seeing the same temperatures as the other two here. They didn't have as much cooling in the head. There wasn't the use for it, and so you only have this one singular cooling manifold or cooling outlet for the manifold here. On the 3B and on the AAN, they both have this drilled out in these three other spots to allow for more coolant to flow out and for better cooling of the overall head. That kind of comes into play if you wanted to use a 7A motor in a turbo application. One of the things you would want to do is machine for that and allow for more cooling to happen. Even with that extra cooling, the AAN and the 3B are both a little bit more prone to cracking, and that's a common problem. If you watched the last video I posted about the engines, I took these two heads down to the machine shop. One of them was slightly warped. It was in a car that overheated the head gasket, and so it's a little bit warped, and I could have had it straightened, but I kind of just wanted a nice, clean, no drama, no problems head. This other head had a lot of cracks. You can actually see them. They're marked in the yellow there. I don't know how good this is going to come through on the camera, but in between those, this one is actually a pretty big one. You can kind of see it right there in between those two yellow lines, and it goes all the way into the threads there. That one has a couple cracks. That one has a couple cracks. Again, these aren't the craziest things in the world, but a lot of times what you have to end up doing is, filling with material, recutting your threading here, oftentimes taking out the seat, recutting a new seat, installing a new seat. It's a lot of work. If you have a good machine shop, they can definitely help you out and it can go pretty smoothly. But of course the cost goes up. Because of the life that these have lived, a lot of people like to use the 7A heads because they don't have the same cracking. Even though they're the same casting, they haven't had a hard life, and so it's generally lighter duty. Now on this AAN head, like I said, this has the extra ports here. One of the other differences is the fact that the 3B, the 3B motor, also the S2 motors, so both the ABY and ADU motors had this style water manifold. It sits here, bolts up, and you can see that water output right here is on the side here because you have your radiator coming out to the side. If you look at the AAN, it's significantly different, and you have the outlet all the way up here in the front because it's going to go out to a front mount intercooler, or I'm sorry, front mount radiator. So those are the big differences between those two. And again, you can swap this. They're the same part. They both fit on the same head. Everything will work out just fine. But you gotta think about that when you're doing this. And depending on your application, you might want to go with that, or you might want to try to find a 3B motor. The 3B motor is definitely the easier motor. Like this, I pulled out of a junkyard just this last summer. And I could literally just throw this right into the small chassis with really no modifications to the long block here. I'd have to change some of the radiator hoses, and that's about it. It really will just kind of plug right in and drop right in. So it's definitely the easiest one. The other big difference is these early motors, so both the 7A and the 3B, ran off a distributor. You can see it here in the back, and it has standard plug wires. This one had it as well. You can see the hole for it. Both these AAN motors, they definitely have the provision for it because they're all the same castings, but they didn't actually use it. They used a cam position sensor behind the cam, and actually have a standard or a more modern style coil-on plug that was run with these. And so you have your cam position sensor here, and that's what you would actually run for the pickup. Now, on the early heads like these two and that one over there, you can actually see the casting here that was just the standard head, and they basically came at it with their machine. They cut out a slot for this piece to put in. Behind this orange stuff is just actually 2 bolts, and you can actually take this whole mounting point off. You can machine your other head for that, slap this right on, slap on your cam position sensor, and be running the later style ignition. Not always necessary. You can also run your distributor. You can remove the rotor and cap and just use it as a hall sensor and do that. No big changes there. Let's talk about exhaust manifolds. So you have the standard exhaust manifold that came on these cars. I'm going to use this one since it has the turbo off. Now you can see the runners are all kind of separated and so forth. This is the same exhaust manifold that was both on the 3B and the AAN, as well as the ABY motor. In Europe, they also had the RS2 motor, which basically was it was an Audi long block, just like these, that Porsche went through and kind of made some tweaks and changes to it. So one of the changes that they did make was to the exhaust manifold. And this is an actual Audi RS2 exhaust manifold. It is an actual OEM part, but it has different runners. You can see that they're kind of attached. There's the inside diameter is a little bit larger, and it allows for better flow. A different style collector, and the whole point is that it should flow better in these applications. It is, however, the same size, same mounting provisions, and it puts the turbo in the exact same position. And so it's a really, really common upgrade on these 20-valve turbo motors, because you can literally just bolt it straight up without any other modifications. You don't have to change out your oil lines, your cooling lines. It all bolts up, all keeps it in the stock position. Your downpipe will work. Everything just works, which is a really convenient option. Now, another small change that they made between the oil housings here. This is the 7A, naturally aspirated, no turbo stuff going on, so it's just my video cut off, so I gotta throw this back in here. So one of the other differences I talked about was this oil filter housing. This is the naturally aspirated engine. You can see it just has the filter. It doesn't have anything else on there. Whereas on the turbocharged models, you definitely have a different housing. You have the oil feed line, and you also have lines that run off of it for your oil cooler. Small difference. Again, they're all interchangeable. You can bolt this up to a 7A block, no problem. It all interchanges. One of the other quick things I wanted to talk about was actually the valve covers. This is the standard 7A valve cover, and I'm also going to show what this looks like in car. So I have another quick clip here that I'll show you. Here's an example of a mostly stock 7A, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about, where even on the 7A intake manifold, this is reversed, comes back over the hotter side of the engine due to that radiator sitting there. Just gives it more space. So now you know kind of what it looks like with the intake manifold over it. This is what it looks like bare. This one's actually been machined to accept the larger style, or later style I should say, 1.8T coil packs, R8 coil packs, whatever. This is the 3B valve cover. This is the little trim piece. Just put it on there to kind of show. And then of course this is the AAN. The AAN also has a cover here with the coil packs attached that I don't have right now. Again, here's a shot of that in my other car, what it looks like all together. Because these are all the same heads, they're all cast in the same way, any of these valve covers will work on any of these motors. However, it will change which manifold you can run. Now with the 3B manifold, you can run a 3B cover, you can also run a 7A cover, but you cannot run the AAN cover. The 3B manifold is a little too short, and it runs into the top of the thing here. You can actually see how it actually sits above the head here. There's even indents on these ones to allow for that throttle cable to actuate. The Europeans had the ABY intake manifold, which I have one here to show. Now the ABY and ADU, this is actually the same castings. This is where it would say powered by Porsche. They're the same basic castings, but they're made to work with this AAN style head and the AAN style coil packs. And this one, because where it runs, it actually runs well, technically it's right about there, it runs past the valve cover. It goes a little bit further back towards the firewall and will clear it. It also has a better style fuel rail with the later style fuel pressure regulator, which is very easy to find, whereas the AAN, or I'm sorry, the 3B fuel pressure regulator there, those are no longer available, and they're kind of hard to find. The 7A had a 4-bar, whereas the 3B had a 3-bar. Small differences, nothing really crazy. Again, everything kind of works with everything. You just got to make sure you put it all in the right order. So if you want to run the AAN style valve cover, you need the ABY intake, or you need one of the aftermarket ones that I also mentioned. You can add and you can buy different intake manifolds. You can buy OEM manifolds. You can also buy aftermarket. There's a few companies that make them. MTM used to make a ton of these where they were actually reversed inlet, and it would come down here. Wagner makes another one. BST still makes another one to this day. There's lots of different options, and generally that's what you do, is you find the AAN motor, because they seem to be much more plentiful, and you can put a different intake manifold on them. You can put a different water manifold on them and make it work in your application without much headache. Both motors, both turbo motors I should say, came with the same K24 7000 turbo. They were rated at different powers, but that actually had to do with the ECU and the tuning on it. So the AAN had a little bit more power. It was obviously using the coil-on plug, which helps, and then also they have a 2.5 bar map sensor in the ECU versus the 2 bar that was in the 3B. That's kind of one of the limiting factors, and a lot of people, again, like to use the AAN ECU. It's more tunable. There's more off-the-shelf parts for it. It's a little bit easier to find and tune and do that stuff. When you're swapping into a small chassis car, another thing that's important to know, like I said, this intake manifold is going to clear your radiator, whereas the AAN is going to shoot it right into your radiator. You either have to relocate this, and I've seen people chop it off and re-weld it up here to have it go in front of the radiator, and that works. The other problem is the oil pans are slightly different shapes, and generally speaking, the bottom of this oil pan can hit the radiator as well. The 7A and the 3B have a different shaped oil pan, and it actually has a small extension here on the side to allow for the oil that they displaced from the other side to move to this side. And in Europe, on the turbo car, on the small chassis, so the S2s, they had a different oil pan extension, and you'll note that this obviously has this nice machined in oil return flange, and so this oil return would actually come over here and be into the oil pan directly. You would have space for your AC compressor right here, so the AC compressor would sit here. This would no longer be here, but it would be over here in this oil pan extension to give you the space to run it all on that side of the engine. The later S2 motors, they had a different style harmonic balancer, but you'll notice that the 3B and the 7A both have the same style of harmonic balancer. It switched on the AAN, and they went to a serpentine belt. One of the only other differences with the actual castings for these blocks is because of that serpentine belt and having all of the accessories right here on this side of the engine, they added another mounting provision into the block here to help support this bracketry. And if you don't have that extra support, you can't fully bolt on this bracket, or you'd be short a hole. You could do it, but you know, I've heard of people not wanting to do it because obviously Audi put it there for a reason and so forth. But on this motor, you don't have it. It's another mounting point that's literally right here. The thermostat housings and so forth, they're all the same. Everything is the same except for that one little bolt hole. That's something that they added specifically to support the extra weight of the AAN stuff here. So I'm going to wrap it here. That's pretty much everything you need to know. If there's more questions or comments, feel free to ask. I'm happy to help out people, but it's definitely the question that I get asked the most. So when you're shopping for a motor, you know, try to find one locally. Try to find something that you can get, you can see running first. You can make sure that it works, and then go with that for your project. If you're gonna do a huge crazy rebuild, you might as well start with a 7A if that's what's in your donor car. You know, get that 7A and start building that up. Throw in pistons, throw in rods, and just go big right off the bat. That works. You're gonna spend some money, you know, building it up. That's all right. If you're trying to stay below 500 horsepower, it's probably going to be a lot cheaper for you to buy a full running 3B or AAN to start with. If you're going for that 600 plus, start with the 7A. Just start right off the bat, especially if that's what you have in your car. Start with that and just rebuild it. Keep on going from there. Any questions, comments below, please post them. I'll try to respond to everything.